which denominations are closest to Catholics and which ones are furthest away. That's what we're going to be looking at in this video, but we'll start with a couple disclaimers. First, this is kind of subjective. I think many of you will agree with some of the picks for what's close, but when we get further away, there may be some of you who have a different theory. I'd love to see them in the comments. Second, in this video, the Catholic Church is the center of the galaxy, and we're looking at who is further from them. But just because two denominations are equally as far from the Catholics doesn't necessarily mean that they're close to each other. In this video, we'll basically have a tier list, so it could look that way, but keep in mind that all I'm actually trying to do is sort by distance from the Catholics. And third, I'm considering everything. Theology is one thing that makes you further, but so is practice, church government structure, and worship style. So if a denomination's view on salvation overshadows everything else in your opinion, your list will be differently ordered than mine. And fourth and final disclaimer, and this one's big, we're basically making this determination based on the classic beliefs of these denominational traditions. So for Catholics, we're basing things on the reality that the Catholic Church is opposed to birth control, for example, and opposed to abortion, and that it teaches that the bread and wine in communion becomes the body and blood of Christ. Not all members believe it, but they do teach it, so that's what I'm considering Catholicism. Likewise, other denominations like Lutherans and Methodists will be considering that they teach their traditional set of theology. Not that we're looking at a looser church that doesn't care so much. Like, I consider Lutherans to be pretty liturgical and that they believe in baptismal regeneration, but some Lutherans don't fit the bill. That's the problem with generalizing. Also, I don't mention absolutely every denomination. Sorry if you don't get mentioned. Okay, so let's begin. We'll start with the close ones, and in box number 1, for closest, I'm going to drop in the Eastern Orthodox. I don't think that's surprising. There's really far fewer differences between Orthodox and Catholic than either of them have to Protestantism. They both have 7 sacraments. They both revere Mary more than Protestants do and teach things like her perpetual virginity. Both have iconography, both have priesthoods, both have an episcopal polity, both use the Apocrypha. There's a bunch of other similarities. In the same box, although I would put them slightly further away than Eastern Orthodox, is the Oriental Orthodox churches, which I'll represent with the Coptic cross. And some of the churches in the Oriental Orthodox are further than others. Once again, we do have the Apocrypha, but the canon is different between Armenians and Coptics, for example. And there's the whole Miaphysite view of Christ having one nature that is divine and human. I've got a whole video on that, by the way. All right, so now we're going to move on to Protestant denominations. Now, if you have your own list you've been building in your mind, go ahead and blurt out the one you think is closest, because I think a lot of us are going to agree. And I'm going with Anglicans. Of course, there's a spectrum here, but the things I think of with Anglicanism that make it win out as the closest Protestant tradition to Catholics are, once again, a common claim of 7 sacraments, even if they do distinguish between sacraments of the Church and of the Gospel. And there's a pretty open mind to the Apocrypha, even if it isn't canon. There's the Episcopal Church government, the view of apostolic succession. There's also far less fear of iconography and even veneration of Mary in many Anglican churches than other Protestants have. Now, if by chance you disagreed with me on Anglicans and named some other denomination, it's probably what I've got next, and that's Lutherans. So Lutherans are less familiar with the Apocrypha, but often still very high church, and they're also closer to the Catholic Eucharistic theology than many other Protestants are. Now you may say classical Lutherans say the Pope is the Antichrist, but just because they have some major problems with the Catholics doesn't mean that they aren't close in many other areas. So I think Lutherans rightly belong here. Of course, with the Orthodox, Anglicans, and Lutherans, we've been hanging on to infant baptism this whole time, and Lutherans believe baptism saves, which many Protestants don't. Also, Lutherans are like Catholics in not being into decision theology, and that a person can fall away from salvation and be lost. Church government varies for Lutherans. Obviously, those that have bishops and an episcopal structure are much closer to Catholics in that regard than the congregational denominations. So in the next level, I think we have several denominations, and it's hard to decide who's closer and further. So first, we're going to put in Presbyterian and Reformed, which I basically consider practically synonymous for the sake of this video. We've got a spiritual presence view of communion, which I believe is further from Catholics than the Lutheran view. We have perseverance of the saints and limited atonement, once again moving us further from Catholics. Presbyterian church government, that's an intentional reform, and it moves us further from Catholics. Still infant baptism, but it's not related to salvation to the same extent Catholics would go. Presbyterians can be pretty iconoclast, not allowing in some cases for any images of Jesus or God at all. So then we have Methodist and Wesleyan holiness, which I am also putting together because in their classic original form, they don't look all that different. Some may dispute that, but I would controversially say that the core traditional Methodist position is very close to the traditional Wesleyan holiness position. It's just that a large amount of Methodists today hold those positions much more loosely. But that's not the point, and we're going to use Wesley's face to represent these folks. So, do Methodists land closer to Catholics than Presbyterians? This is one where I think that it shines through that though they may be near equidistant from Catholics, they're not close to each other necessarily. These denominations have different reasons for being the distance from Catholicism that they are. For example, Methodists are closer to Catholics in their view that a saved person can fall from grace, no perseverance of the saints. Some Methodists have a more Catholic view of the Eucharist, since after all, Methodism came from Anglicanism and real presence can follow from that, though it doesn't always. I don't think the doctrine of entire sanctification or Christian perfection puts them closer to Catholics, and we again have a mixed bag on church government. Many are Episcopal, so that's closer to Catholics than the Presbyterians are. Although Methodists believe mostly in infant baptism, I think there are more exceptions among Methodists than among Presbyterians. Methodists, too, can be quite liturgical, and there may be a bit of apocrypha used liturgically, which most of the remaining denominations I'll mention won't touch at all. So on paper, I think it looks like Methodists are closer than Presbyterians, but in the U.S. today, some of that is lost when it comes to how churches are actually run. Let me know in the comments if Methodists or Presbyterians are closer to Catholic in your view. So now we're going to have Congregationalists, and we're going to use Jonathan Edwards' face for them. They still have infant baptism, commonly have a Reformed view of communion, which is closer to Catholics than the memorial view, which is in many of the denominations about to be mentioned. Often these are very liturgical, but we've lost the similar church polity, and of course today many churches in this tradition are quite theologically liberal, so they don't always reflect their heritage in a way that you could see the similarities to Catholic doctrine that are present in their original confessions. Traditionally, Congregationalists also held to perseverance of the saints, so that distances them from Catholics a bit more. Now I think we're going to get a bit controversial here in the next few picks. In this level, I'm putting Pietist denominations like Evangelical Free. The thing here is that there is freedom to do certain more Catholic things in these denominations, even if they're not always done. So Evangelical Free churches can baptize infants, but many don't allow it. They can have a view of presence of Christ in communion, though in practice many hold to a symbolic view. They could teach that you can fall from grace, but many teach perseverance of the saints. Church polity is normally congregational, which is almost as far from Catholic as you can get, and they teach a one-time born-again experience across the board, which is also not a traditional Catholic view. Also, baptism sometimes is quite de-emphasized. So forgive me if you disagree, but I'm also putting Church of Christ at this same level. We don't have infant baptism here, and also baptism is only by immersion, but we do have the connection of baptism to salvation. Like Catholics, they deny perseverance of the saints. They most commonly also have an amillennial eschatology, which makes them closer to Catholic than Evangelical Free in that area. Church of Christ also views itself commonly as not Protestant, but being the true church Christ began, which is a view Catholics also hold of themselves. Additionally, Church of Christ tends to have weekly communion, which is more than some of the other denominations already mentioned. But the view of ordained ministry is extremely far from the Catholic view, and on the whole, Church of Christ is very anti-Catholic. And there are no instruments in worship, which, though it is different from many Catholics today that use the organ, there are still Catholic churches that don't use instruments, and it was a very common thing in the past. I think many traditional Catholics would be more comfortable with Church of Christ worship style than the contemporary style of many Evangelical Free or Baptist churches, for example. Church government is a plurality of elders, but within the congregation, so quite unlike Catholics. Also, the anti-creedal and confessional view is very far from Catholicism. So with that, we move down one level further, and here I'm going to place Baptists for one. Like Church of Christ, we're talking baptism only by immersion and only for believers, but also it's not connected to salvation. Communion is entirely symbolic. Worship style is normally not liturgical. Icons are rejected, along with any use of the Apocrypha. There's congregational government. In some cases, there's a suspicion of creeds and confessions as well, which is also something present in Churches of Christ. Eschatology is often premillennial and often dispensational too, which is completely unlike the Catholic view. Communion can be pretty infrequent. Quarterly is common, which is very unlike Catholics. Most Baptists, though not all, hold to eternal security or perseverance of the saints. Most would deny limited atonement, though, which Catholics do too. However, there are Reformed Baptists who affirm it. Baptists historically were also heavily focused against state religion and were strongly in favor of total religious liberty, allowing Muslims and Jews to be able to have freedom too. This is not the traditional Catholic position. Some Baptists have closed communion like Catholics. I am also putting Pentecostals on the same level. We'll use a flame to represent them. There's a lot of similarities to what I said about Baptists, with a few of the main differences being that some Pentecostals teach in this life entire sanctification, making them less like Catholics. In general, they don't teach eternal security or perseverance of the saints, making them more like Catholics. And of course, their teaching on a post-salvation spirit baptism, evidenced by speaking in tongues, is not like Catholics. However, some Baptists and Presbyterians and Reformed are cessationist, meaning they believe that certain spiritual gifts ceased at the completion of Scripture or death of the apostles, which is not a Catholic position, and Pentecostals are about as far from cessationism as you can find. Some Catholic claims, such as continuing miracles that they use as part of canonization of sainthood, fit together with some Pentecostal claims, although both sides are likely to deny the particular claims of the other. Most Pentecostals have open communion, which is unlike Catholics. I'm also putting most non-denominational churches on the same level. The majority of non-denominational churches will look like what I've described for Baptists or Pentecostals, with some minor differences depending on the individual congregation. Also, I would put on the same level Plymouth Brethren. Some have closed communion, and there is weekly communion, which is closer to Catholic, but a common practice of having no formal pastor of a church, and effectively lay elder leadership is very unlike Catholics. They are also dispensational premillennial, so less Catholic there, and baptism is nearly always for believers only, but some groups have done household baptism, including infants. They believe in eternal security. Many churches have unprogrammed worship where there is not an order of service going in, but people wait to be led by the Spirit to speak or sing. Generally, they're cessationists. And now we go one level further down. On this level, I'll put Anabaptists, represented on the chart as Menno Simons. Some Anabaptists in the past were even more radically different from Catholics than those today, but when you think of groups like the Amish, there's still a lot of differences to point out. Once again, you have no infant baptism, you have conscientious objection to war, and even further, you have complete non-resistance. In some traditions today, like Bruderhof, Hutterites, and conservative Mennonites and Amish, you have plain dress. Amish, of course, also have aversion to much of modern technology. Some Anabaptists are completely a cappella singing and worship. Sometimes there is lay leadership. Typically, they're opposed to the teaching of eternal security. More conservative groups may reject participation in government at all, and some also reject having secular careers, instead doing all the work within the community. Bruderhof and Hutterites have communal colonies with very little private property. I recognize even with these differences, some might put Anabaptists today on the previous level, closer to Catholics, and especially the less conservative groups may fit there, as they have fewer of these differences. Plus, Anabaptists like to use pouring for baptism like Catholics do. On the same level, but recognizing they are probably a bit further still, is Adventism, represented by William Miller. Now, things can vary between different Adventist denominations a bit, but one thing they deny is eternal hell, which is something all the other denominations mentioned affirm, along with Catholics. Additionally, many Adventists are non-combatants or conscientious objectors in war. Most Adventists also worship on Saturday as the Sabbath, though some denominations don't. Some Adventists also require abstaining from the unclean foods listed in the Bible. Adventists are historic premillennial, which is unlike Catholics. Typically, they're opposed to the teaching of eternal security. Also on this level, we'll put Quakers. Quakers often reject physical sacraments, not practicing water baptism or communion with bread and cup. Some have unprogrammed worship. Often, entire sanctification is affirmed. Many are opposed to war, and historically many have been opposed to celebrating holidays. The most liberal Quakers would probably belong further out than this. There certainly are levels beyond this too, and at this point you start getting not only distant from Catholics, but you begin to make many Protestants uncomfortable too. So many groups that reject enough traditional teaching to be this far out aren't considered properly Christian by many Catholics and Protestants. I would put Swedenborgians, for example, even further out, World Mission Society Church of God, Eastern Lightning, Latter-day Saints, and others that have significant differences on even larger points than the ones we've mentioned. So what do you think? Would you put things in the same order? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more Christian denomination videos like this one.